Okay, I'm going to save Dr. Rendsburg's bio, or at least a more expanded version, for next week when Jack Welch gets to introduce him when he's here in person for our keynote. But I will just briefly mention a couple of things. So Gary Rendsburg holds the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish History in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He earned his MA and PhD in Hebrew Studies from the New York University, and his main research interests are the literature of the Bible, the history of ancient Israel, the historical development of the Hebrew language, and the relationship between ancient Egypt and ancient Israel. He has been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, and also a fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we're so excited that he is so graciously willing to join us. We're excited for his comments today about Abraham's homeland and for his comments next week when he's here in person. So Dr. Rendsburg, take it away.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you everyone at BYU for organizing the conference and inviting me one time remotely today and in person a week from today. And I look forward to being in everyone's presence. It's always great to be in person, but we also have the technology to allow us this remote connection. Okay, so Ur of the Chaldees, where is Abraham's birthplace? What can we say about the geography of the site referred to in the Bible as Ur of the Chaldees? So there we go. So I'm going to start with the typical map that most of the textbooks and Bible atlases include. This is one example of it, of course, showing you Abraham's home in Ur of southern Mesopotamia, what is known more objectively as Ur of Sumer. That's the land of the Sumerians, although it also says Babylonians right there. And first of all, thanks to my colleagues who preceded me this afternoon, including Stephen Ricks, who referred to my work. And now you'll see that develop more. And also the Seeleys, who referenced my work, although in a different connection. This map, to put it simply, is wrong. And it's not just this map. If you go into Google and ask for it to search the Route of Abraham map or something like that, I know you can't see these, but you can see so many similar maps starting with starting in the south of Mesopotamia, where Ur is located, and journeying through much of the Near East. Now, I want to make it clear, there is a city called Ur, exactly where this map shows you, and we will go look at Ur. It's a well-excavated site. It is a very important Near Eastern archaeological site, but it is not the Ur from which Abraham came. So, what are the problems? If this is the Ur of Abraham, the Bible tells us at the end of Genesis 11 that Abraham left Ur to travel to the land of Canaan, but he stopped in Haran. And when he got to Haran with Terah, his father, this is where the journey stopped. Now, if you were starting at Ur in the south of Mesopotamia, what is today southern Iraq, and this map actually shows you the word Sumer there, and you wanted to go to the land of Canaan, you had a couple of options. You would go upstream on the Euphrates, that would be obvious, and then when you got to Mari, which you see in the middle of this map, you could head west across the desert, stopping at the great oasis site of Palmyra in modern-day Syria, and then you would reach the arable land around Damascus and into the land of Canaan. Or you could continue up the Euphrates River to what we call the Great Bend. It would be a longer trek, more miles, more kilometers. And then from the Great Bend, you could head west to Aleppo and then start heading south through Damascus to the land of Canaan. The one thing you would never do is somehow go up the Euphrates and instead of heading west, head further north to the site of Haran. or to put this in 21st century terms, if you entered Ur to, let's say, Shechem in the land of Canaan into your GPS, it would not take you through Haran. It would give you the usual GPS options, but none of them would lead that far north. So the geography simply makes no sense. Now, this is what the Hebrew text looks like, and I've highlighted in the red and in the bold exactly the issue here, right? And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, and the son of his son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, the wife of Abram his son. And they went out with him from Ur Kasdim. That's how you say Ur of the Chaldees in Hebrew. From Ur Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and they settled there. So what I was just discussing and showing you on the map makes no sense in light of Genesis 11, verse 31. Or if we go back to this map, the first one I showed, there is no way that you would go as far north as Haran if you were journeying from Ur in the south of Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan. Here is your GPS options, as I said, using Google Maps. This is the first one that takes you to where more or less Mari is located, and then across the Syrian desert with a stop in Palmyra. Or the second option, which I gave you, which is to go further north along the Euphrates and then start heading west, southwest before you reach the land of Canaan. And at just north of the modern day Syrian-Turkish border, I've put the large red dot there, is where the city of Haran is. You simply would not go there. And everybody agrees that this is the site of Haran. It is still called that today. And you could see that if I had zoomed in on this map. So, and there you have it. This is an impossibility. This map and so many other maps that approach the subject this way are simply incorrect. This one shows you the impossibility of going that far to Haran. Now, more biblical evidence is forthcoming when you look at the book of Joshua. When Joshua is about to die in the last chapter, chapter 24, and he gives a speech to the people of Israel, he refers to the fact that the God of Israel, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, beyond the river your fathers dwelled from of old, Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods, still in their polytheistic stage before Abraham became the worshiper of the one true God. And I took your father Abraham from beyond the river. The phrase is repeated there, Me'ever HaNahar. So that means that Abraham's birthplace, homeland, must be beyond the river. But if you look at this map again, you'll see that Ur in southern Mesopotamia is not beyond the Euphrates River. Another problem for those who would place it there. It's on the Euphrates. This map takes it a little bit off the Euphrates. And in fact, to be pedantic, it's on the same side as the Euphrates as the land of Canaan. Joshua would not be saying that Terah and Abraham lived beyond the river, meaning the Euphrates, unless you were to locate Ur in another location, as we are going to do, locating it north of Haran in the area of the P and the A, where it says Padan Aram, a term we'll come back to, as you can see. Now, there's Haran on our Google map, just north of the Turkish-Syrian border. And north of there is a city known today in Turkish as Sanli Urfa, known prior as simply Urfa. In the Syriac Christian tradition, it was the great center of Syriac Christianity during the time of the Byzantine Empire and beyond. It was called Edessa, and we know that this is the place called Ura in ancient times, or for short, just Ur. That syllable still embedded into the Turkish name Urfa, or more properly, Sanli Urfa. And this site makes geographical sense. In other words, place Urfa or Ur north of Haran, and now A, it is beyond the river, Euphrates, and B, you actually would go through Haran if you left northern Ur and headed to the land of Canaan. Moreover, in Genesis 24, when Abraham says to his servant, commands his servant to go back to the land to obtain a bride for Isaac, and you know the story, this is where Rebekah is introduced and returns with the servant. Abraham says to the servant in verse 4, "For unto my land and unto my birthplace you shall go, and you shall take a wife for my son Isaac." So Abraham is actually saying, go back to my birthplace to obtain the bride for Isaac. And where does he go, the servant? Middle text box that you see here in Genesis 24, he goes to the area called Aram Naharaim, which means Aram of the two rivers, or to put that in our terms, Aram of Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia being the Greek word for between the two rivers. Aram Naharaim, Aram of the two rivers, later on called Padan Aram 10 times in the book of Genesis. And Aram, everybody agrees, is not in southern Mesopotamia, but is the area more or less of modern day Syria, spilling over across the modern political boundary into Turkey today. Now, if we look at the family tree of Abraham, you see Abraham there on the upper left, and he is the son of Terah, as you see. And there are other names in this family tree about which we can say something quite important to our subject. Now, the great-grandfather of Abraham, or the grandfather of Terah, was a man named Serug. This is actually the name of a city exactly where you would want to find it in that area. I showed you Haran and Sanli Urfa before. Serug is just to the west of there, in its Turkic pronunciation, Suruc, but it's still called that name in variant ways in Syriac and in Greek, Seruch, and those you see in the right-hand text box. In fact, one of the most famous of all the Syriac Christian church fathers is Jacob of Serug, who came from this town. So when you see Abraham's family tree with Serug in it, you should think about the fact that, oh, well, that's the great city in that very region where we are now locating Abraham. And then there's Nahor, who is the name of both Abraham's grandfather and his brother. Different individuals, but the same name. And we have all of this material in Genesis chapter 11. Now, we have numerous attestations in Akkadian, especially, of a city called Nahor in that region, even though no one has been able to locate it specifically or explicitly yet. But we know where it has to be in what we call the Upper Balach River Valley, which is the area around Haran and Urfa, going south from there to the city that you see on the map, Raqqa, which is actually on the Euphrates River. So the standard work on Mesopotamian geography, toponyms being the technical word we use in scholarship for place names, the Old Babylonian toponymy of Upper Mesopotamia. In this standard book by Ziegler and Langlois, you have about 40 attestations of Nahor in the Mari text, which is one of these great archival collections of several thousand cuneiform tablets. Again, we don't know exactly where it is, but it must be somewhere in the region in the Upper Balach Valley. And here you see a map showing you the Balach River with Urfa just to the north of the little box that I put on the screen for you. So once again, you'll hear me repeat this throughout my presentation. How many times have you heard me yet? And by the way, you can see Mari there. This is wrong. The map is simply incorrect. Now, how did we get to that map accordingly? If it's all so simple, why is that? Why are scholars so misguided? If we were to go back to the time period before the study of the subject of Assyriology with the decipherment of the Akkadian language, which occurred in 1845, and then numerous, literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, cuneiform documents now at our disposal, starting with the excavations by Layard in the 1840s. If you were to go back before that, we should look at a standard commentary on the book of Genesis, including this one, published by George Bush in 1839. This George Bush, by the way, taught at my alma mater, New York University. At the time, if you can read the small print, professor of Hebrew and Oriental literature at New York City University. They dropped that third word and it's now just called New York University, NYU. George Bush was the great professor of biblical studies there in the 19th century. And yes, he is an ancestor of the President's Bush. In fact, to my eye, he actually has, and his namesakes, to my eye, he actually has a somewhat striking similarity, profile, facial features to President Bush Sr. I hope you will agree with me. And this great scholar of the 19th century, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, says exactly what I have been telling you right now. If we start there on the upper left. As to the city here mentioned, he's now in the end of Genesis 11 when he writes this. In the east, it is generally identified with the present town of Urfa in Upper Mesopotamia, 2 days' journey east of the Euphrates, 67 miles northeast of Be'er. The Jews, meaning the local Jews in that town, according to Mr. Wolf, and I've never been able to track down who he is, still call the place by the name in the text, Kasdim, or Ur of the Chaldees, and it is a place of pilgrimage as the birthplace of Abraham. The majority population there would have been Muslim, and therefore he continues, in whose honor the Muslims have a fine mosque, in the court of which is a lake teeming with fish, which are held to be sacred to the patriarch and are not permitted to be caught. In other words, the Jews and Muslims of the city of Urfa into the 19th century, and in fact into the 20th century, held that their city was the birthplace of Abraham. They never engaged in scholarship. There was no Akkadian to be read yet. They simply knew the local tradition which had been passed down from antiquity, which I think should be accorded a correctness, not out of any naivete or blind faith, but simply because it matches the geography that I have been describing here for you. If you want to know more about George Bush, the biblical scholar, and his family tree descendants down to the 2 presidents Bush, I can highly recommend a book by my friend and colleague Shalom Goldman called God's Sacred Tongue, all about the role of Hebrew in colonial and early America. And Shalom was also my fellow student at NYU, and we both did our PhDs there. So this is what somebody would write in the 1830s. It was simply just understood that this is where Kasdim, or Ur of the Chaldees, was to be located. There is the sacred fish pool in the courtyard of the mosque, which George Bush described. Now, accordingly, this town has numerous names. In the Ebelite text, which I'll get to in a moment, it is called Uru. Hebrew tends to drop final short vowels, so it's simply Ur. In Greek, it was Edessa, named that way by Seleucus I. The Syriac name Orhai continues that Ur tradition. In Arabic, it's called Aruha, a slight change in the pronunciation. And in Turkish, as I said, still Urfa or Sanli Urfa. My friend and colleague, and I don't know if he's in the room, but I will certainly see him next weekend when I'm in Provo, Paul Hoskison, retired from BYU, has written about the same thing. Where was Ur of the? And of course, he and I share the same academic pedigree because we both did our PhDs with Cyrus Gordon, in the great biblical scholar of the 20th century. I studied with Professor Gordon at NYU. Paul studied with him a decade or so earlier at Brandeis University. Now, I mentioned Ebla before. This is the approximate location of Ebla. I mean, I could have put a dot on the map, but it would have been very small, so you get to see where it is in northern Syria, not far from Aleppo. And again, cuneiform documents there are part of our story. In the 1970s, several thousand cuneiform documents were found there. They are mainly economic and administrative texts where you don't get any great literature or very little of it, no Gilgamesh epic, and so on at Mari, ditto. We just get the typical admin and economic texts, trade documents, political documents sometimes, legal documents. And in the course of those documents, there are multiple references to a place called Uru. And in fact, in some of those documents, don't you just love the way we translate form? Those of you who've never been introduced to the subject, you get a sense of how it's done here. This was done by Professor Alfonso Archi, the chief epigrapher of the Ebla excavation. And in one text, in several texts, I should say, you see one of them here, Uru is mentioned in the same breath, as it were, as the city of Haran. They are therefore in close proximity to one another. Here is another example of an Uru mention, and you can see the various documents here giving you their cuneiform designations and so on, of Uru and Haran appearing in the same cuneiform tablets. Now, when we go to Genesis 22, right after the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah, we have another genealogy where we're told that the brother of Abraham, Nahor, has fathered all manner of children. And one of them, Kemuel, is called the father of Aram. And then in the next breath, you get a person called Kesed in Hebrew, although it's usually Chesed or Chesed in the English, as you see I've highlighted. So Aram and Kesed are juxtaposed in these two verses, one coming at the end of verse 21, the other coming at the very beginning of verse 22. But once again, we're all in the same geographical region. Now, a word about some arcane Hebrew phonology. The S sound that you see in Kesed is not the standard S. It's got a bit of an L to it as well, an L sound merging with the S sound. So that when this was transmitted into Greek, Latin, and the other European languages, including English, we say Chaldea in English, the Chaldeans, but in Hebrew, it's the Kasdim. It would have been more like Kasdim if you just heard my pronunciation of that word. Now, a great Greek historian, Xenophon, in his two works written in the 4th century BCE, he mentions the Chaldeans as neighbors of the Armenians and the Carducci. They are the ancestors of the modern day Kurds. And it was our teacher, Cyrus Gordon, who pointed this out in several publications during the 1950s. Therefore, you should find the Chaldeans or Kasdim or of the Chaldees, not in the south of Mesopotamia, but in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, where the Kurds and the Armenians live. This is not such a great map, but it's one I found which actually gives us Carducci in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, and further north of that, Armenia. And in fact, it's in Armenia where you get the headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So therefore, you need to find, according to Xenophon, you would place the Chaldeans in that area, and that is exactly the area I was showing you before along the Turkish Syrian border, north of Padan Aram that you see here. That is the homeland of the Chaldeans. So how did it all go wrong? Henry Rawlinson was the great cuneiform specialist of the 19th century, a polymath, man of many talents, served in the British government and in the army in Iraq, Iran, India, and Afghanistan as a diplomat and a soldier, but also was one of the decipherers of the first cuneiform tablets that came out of the ground by Layard during his excavations at Nineveh. And Rawlinson then spent the rest of his life back in London at the British Museum, publishing the tablets. His colleague, John Taylor, went off and excavated a site in the far southern part of Iraq, Tel Muqayr, and that turned out to be the great city of Ur, which I showed you on the map and told you is a real place. I'm not denying that there's a place called Ur there. Taylor did not express any opinion about any connection to Abraham, but in his wake, Rawlinson did. These are some of the drawings of Taylor's excavations in the 19th century. I just love looking at these old archaeological reports from, in this case, 170 years ago, where you just get to see how these intrepid explorers did all the work by themselves. Today, you would have somebody who draws, somebody who digs, somebody who analyzes this specialty, that specialty. And here is his drawing of the Great Ziggurat of Ur. And he just did basic soundings there. And again, showing you some of the work that Taylor did. And then in his 7 years later, Rawlinson published this famous article, Athenaeum, the Athenaeum being one of the great scholarly journals of a general nature in England. Notice the name of the Athenaeum, as if everything goes back to Athens. And in 1862, published an article with the short title, Biblical Geography. And there he says that the Muhair place that Taylor excavated 7 years earlier is in fact the location of Ur of the Chaldees. And he says something there about the Kasdim in the bottom text box as well. Rawlinson, accordingly, is the one who sets scholars on the wrong path. With no evidence whatsoever that this is Ur of the Chaldees, top line that you see, he just made the proclamation because of his greatness as a scholar, basically convinced the scholarly world. And so people started forgetting about the Urfa, which George Bush and others had propounded. So there's Rawlinson, great scholar, a hero to us all, but incorrect on this issue. A half a century later, Sir Leonard Woolley went and excavated Ur, and this is a color photo of the excavations today, for about 12 years, as you see here, during the 1920s and 30s. That's Woolley on the right, with a colleague who you will recognize when I show you the next image. That is T.E. Lawrence in both of these images. T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, also engaged in archaeology with Woolley at different sites, including at Carchemish that you see here, photo from 1913, and then later on at Ur. Woolley published the results of his excavation and actually had the temerity to call the book Ur of the Chaldees, although I repeat, there is not a shred of evidence that would connect this great site to Abraham of the Bible. And just 2 years earlier to that, had written a different book, Abraham, Recent Discoveries and Hebrew Origins. Now, what guided him to do that? It is true that after a time, the area of Babylonia in the south also came to be known as Chaldea. You see that already in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, in the book of Habakkuk, in the book of Kings. The Babylonians become known as the Chaldeans, but they migrated there from the north, and you can actually see Haran on this map, and further north of Haran, only at a later stage, let's say the 9th or 8th centuries. Prior to that, the Chaldeans are in the north, which is, of course, when Abraham lived prior to the migration of the Chaldeans from northern Mesopotamia to southern Mesopotamia. So I have no problem putting Chaldea here on the map in the later biblical period and having a city there called Ur. It's just not the place where Abraham came from. As I said earlier, when I gave you this verse, it simply does not work. And so we come back to this map right here. The main arrow that you see here does not work with all of the geography. It is an impossibility. When Woolley's book was republished in 1982 by another British archaeologist, Roger Morey, notice what Morey did. He put of the Chaldees into with apostrophes there, what the Brits call inverted commas. And in the preface, he says very honestly about Ur's fame as the birthplace of Abraham and so on and so forth. But then he says, towards the bottom here, that there is no evidence at all, he's honest, to place Abraham at this site. No literary evidence. He's not mentioned in any of the thousands of texts found at Ur, no archaeological evidence, nothing whatsoever. So it's not Ur of the Chaldees, it's Ur, parentheses or apostrophe, of the Chaldees. I would have just renamed the book and called it Ur of Sumer, but they wanted to stay with Woolley's original title. And then in 2000, Pope John Paul stated, if it be God's will, I would like to go to Ur of the Chaldees, the present-day Tel el-Muqayr in southern Iraq, the city where, according to the biblical account, Abraham heard the word of the Lord. Except it's not according to the biblical account. And Herschel Shanks, the late Herschel Shanks, founding editor and for 40 years editor and publisher of Biblical Archaeology Review, even wrote an article in 2000, Is the Pope Going to the Wrong Place? And of course, Shanks quotes Cyrus Gordon and discusses the facts that I'm giving you now. There is nothing to associate Abraham with the city of Ur. Finally, we have some new evidence. This is a new cylindrical inscription in cuneiform dated to approximately 1100 BCE, found recently now in the private collection of David Sofer, a London collector. And you can see it's got cuneiform writing on all of its sides. From this particular king, Ashur-Ketelaesher, who calls himself the king of the land of Mari. It was published by Ron Sadok, an Israeli cuneiform specialist at Tel Aviv University. This is where the text was found to the east of Haran and southeast of Sanli Urfa, as I mentioned before, but still in the general region of northern Mesopotamia. And in this text, it refers to the acts of war by the Chaldeans and the Arameans. Remember in Genesis 22, where Aram and Kesed are referred to each other, one right after another? This is the first cuneiform text ever found which associates Arameans and Chaldeans side by side, exactly as you see in the biblical text in Genesis 22. And as Ron Sadok observed, this text speaks clearly to the fact that the Chaldeans entered Babylonia at a later stage, after 1100 BCE, from the north, not from any other region. They were not native to the south. They are firmly to be located in northern Mesopotamia, exactly where Xenophon would have them in the 4th century, which is to say some of them moved south to Babylonia, but even in Xenophon's day, Chaldeans were still there to be found in northern Mesopotamia alongside the Armenians. But many biblical scholars will say, what if the Torah was written at the time of the 7th or 6th century, when in fact the Chaldeans are to be found in Babylonia? And some scholars would date it even later, to the 6th or 5th century. I can't go into all the details here, except to tell you that this does not hold up when you bring the linguistic evidence into the picture. The usages of the book of Genesis, the Hebrew terms, including something like hinena, behold, please, and the adverbial form terem or biterem, meaning before, these only occur in earlier biblical writings, especially in Genesis, and not in later biblical literature written at the time when indeed the Chaldeans are associated with the Babylonians. And this is also true of the style of the book of Genesis and the Abraham narrative, as discussed by my colleague Frank Polak, another Israeli scholar at Tel Aviv University. So I hope I've convinced you that this map is wrong, and the main arrow, in fact, the other arrows on this map are wrong, but that this map is correct. Haran is to be found where it is presently, where it is still today called Haran, and Ur Kasdim, Ur of the Chaldeans, is to be found north of there in the city of Urfa. The geography makes sense. The Chaldeans are located in that region alongside the Arameans. It is beyond the river, And one would, in fact, stop at Haran if one left Ur and then headed to the land of Canaan. It's always good to hear one more word of Hebrew, Todah, as I've written here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week in person.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Gary?
Yes, John, yes.
Great, okay. So I just have a couple of questions and comments, if you're okay for a few more minutes.
Oh, sure, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. One of them, Micah 5:6, mentions the land of Nimrod, right? And of course, there's a lot of Abraham Nimrod traditions. The land of Nimrod is in Assyria. Does that have any bearing on this at all?
I don't think so. And I have to go back and look at Micah 5:6. Thanks for reminding me of that. And Nimrod, of course, is already mentioned back in Genesis chapter 10. So, and yes, later Jewish tradition, in fact, has a number of legends, midrashim, and so on, connecting Abraham to Nimrod. But that would be, let's put it to you this way: there's no biblical text that connects Abraham to Nimrod, right? It's only later post-biblical Jewish traditions. So I would say that they were created at a certain point, but that the biblical text, when we investigate Genesis, as I have done, firmly places Abraham in northern Mesopotamia.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the thought was Syria seems to have more of a central location in northern Mesopotamia, so I think there was a thought maybe there might be a connection there. The Amenhotep III claim to have plundered Shinar, which is also traditionally Nimrod's land. That again would suggest a northern Mesopotamia, because we don't really have any tradition of Egypt in southern Mesopotamia plundering. But biblical scholars, I think some scholars try to get around that by making it sound like he's just exaggerating. I don't know if you have a thought on that. Are you aware of that particular text from Egypt?
Okay, you cut out, and all I heard was Amenhotep III and something else. So apologies for the technology. Could you repeat it?
That there's a text where he claims to have plundered Shinar, which seems would lean more towards the thesis that we have a northern Mesopotamia land of Shinar, which again is Nimrod and Abraham possible territory. Since we don't have a lot of examples of Egypt in southern Mesopotamia, making incursions there.
Right. Right. So this is new to me. I'm not aware of this. I'm not aware of this Amenhotep III text, but I will certainly look at it. Shinar in Genesis is usually assumed to be the Hebrew way of saying Sumer. The phonology, phonological issues notwithstanding, and that, of course, would only be in the south of Mesopotamia. So I'll have to look at this Amenhotep III inscription. So thanks for sending me along that line. I also want to say the following, which I did not state in my talk, which is actually, if I can have a little PS here. I think the biblical text, by saying Ur of the Chaldees, is required, because if you just said Ur in that ancient Near Eastern world, then everybody would think of Ur, the great Ur, excavated by Woolley in southern Iraq. So the fact that you have to say Ur of the Chaldees suggests that it's not the big Ur, but some other lesser known Ur that requires that kind of additional epithet. The analogy I use, if I'm going to London, I just say I'm going to London. But if I'm going to London, Ontario, I then say I'm going to London, Ontario, to make it clear where I'm going. So it's like Ur would just be London, and Ur of the Chaldees would be like London, Ontario, if that helps. So I wanted to add that here as well. And it's also very possible, this somehow ties into some of the questions, it's very possible that Northern Ur was a trading colony or an outpost of Southern Ur, and hence it got its name. We tend to put new in front of it, but you don't have to. So, New York has something to do with Old York in England, although there's simply York, Pennsylvania as well. So that the use of city names sometimes get transplanted, including London, from the homeland. But that tells us that London, Ontario, 3,000 years from now, people are going to realize that London, Ontario was settled by some English folk who had some connection to London, and that would be accurate because we know of the English settlement in Canada. So, and York, New York, etc. in the U.S., Boston. There's a city of Boston in England. So those suggest to us that in fact these are related, except we don't have enough information to know to what extent Northern Ur would have been a outpost in some fashion of the Great Ur in the south.
Thank you. One other source that you might be interested in if you haven't already seen, this one was brought up by John Gee to us several months ago, but Parpolo's translation in the SSA 10 volume, so some Neo-Assyrian letters that were written to King Esarhaddon of one of his, his servants that were out writing back to him, states this. It says, he's telling the king that Westland, this is the quote, Westland means the Hittite country and the nomad land, or according to another tradition, Chaldea. So we have another source that the Chaldean people are in Hittite territory rather than southern Mesopotamia. So that's another one I think that's a newer source to support your thesis.
Okay,
here. This
is a new one for me, and I'll thank John Gee, and I'll track that one down too. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So just a question for Latter-day Saints, of course, there's some thought about like the religious practice of the area. I'm not sure if that's something that you've looked at quite a bit, but any thoughts on human sacrifice in Ur of the Chaldees?
Oh, I don't think we have enough information. I actually do not do, I am not a student of ritual texts, animal sacrifice, which would have been much more common, or human sacrifice. So no, I have no information about that at all. I can say, of course, and I had some email exchange with Paul Hoskson about this, that in Joseph Smith's day as a contemporary of George Bush, the idea that Abraham came from northern Mesopotamia would have just been standard teaching. Everybody would have believed that until Rawlinson took everybody away. So I guess we should, connect the 1830s and 1840s to, everything that's being discussed in the conference.
Yeah, great. One last one, and this is unrelated to the topic tonight, but a question that someone asks is that you gave a presentation 2 years ago on Hebrew and Egyptian. Are you aware, the question is asking, of any Hebrew texts circa 600 BC written in Hebrew using hieratic or Demotic Egyptian script? Is it true the primary use of hieratic with Hebrew texts on ostraca in the Palestine area are numbers for accounting or government purposes? Are you aware of that corpus of material, the Palestinian hieratic, I think?
Yes, I am. And in fact, the hieratic material is all used for bookkeeping, especially numerals and abbreviations, right? So widely used by Hebrew scribes. We would not know that from the Bible. Every single time there's a numeral mentioned in the Bible, it is written out phonetically. Like if you want to say 3, you have to write it out shalosh, and so on and so forth, or shlosha. But we now know through archaeology, a variety of sites in Israel, that the scribes were well trained in Egyptian hieratic, and in fact, I think the standard text that I use is by David Calabro when I teach this material. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Well, the last comment is something I think we probably all will echo, and that is simply this, that this person says, I have no real questions, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate your passion for this topic. And so thank you for the way you've delivered your thoughts tonight. And there was quite a few chuckles in the audience. You probably didn't get to hear us responding to you, but we did love your passion and how you brought forth those ideas. So thank you one more time for Dr. Rendsburg.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
And we will see you next week in person.
Indeed.